first of all, I may briefly repeat for any of the new listeners that you are well known as being one of the pioneers of promoting Indian knowledge systems, Indian intellectual traditions, let us say broadly, in the whole educational world in India and beyond. And as I just said, you've inspired generations of students. You have been teaching, you corrected me rightly last time, for over 60 years, because you're still teaching today at what is normally regarded as a ripe old age when you're supposed to do nothing, and you are still extremely active. So we are very grateful for this. And last time, you basically explained to us why the label of Sanskrit as a dead language is both silly and irrelevant. But then you had, when I asked you to give us these two talks, you also said that you would like to address the question of why Sanskrit is not the language of the gods. That other label of Deva Bhasha, which has been stuck on it. So would you tell us initially first, what happened? How did Sanskrit get to acquire this label? Why is it not doing Sanskrit such a great service?
Namaskar, all the children sitting there. Sabko namaskar. Good morning. Last time we decided that we cannot call any language dead. That not only just not Sanskrit. You can't talk of death of a language because death is a biological phenomena, and only those things which are born, they die. You can never tell us when was a language born. You can't even tell us when was a word born, any word. So we don't know when it was born, whether it was born at all, or did it grow. So I generally compare language with a field of grass. In a monsoon-fed field of grass with millions of blades of grass growing. And overnight, 100,000 die, another 100,000 come. So in language also, the words go opaque, the words disappear, the words change their form, but new words come. It's an ongoing process. So death is very wrong word to use, and it doesn't apply to language at all. That we agreed last time with sort of other things. Now the other thing that people say about Sanskrit is that Sanskrit Deva Bhasha hai. Now, Deva Bhasha literally will mean language of gods. But obviously, evidently, quite clearly, those who are familiar with the powerful intellectual tradition of Sanskrit, those who are familiar with the highest kind of scientific formulations, made through Sanskrit, they know that this is not a metaphor which will mean language of gods. It's not a literal statement at all. It's a kind of a metaphor. A metaphor. A metaphor for what? Why is it used? It doesn't mean that when people say Sanskrit Deva Bhasha hai, that means that it is a language used in the rituals performed to please gods. जो मंत्र पढ़े जाते हैं, मंत्र पढ़ते हैं, वो संस्कृत में होते हैं और मंत्रों से देवता प्रसन्न होते हैं, इसलिए ये भाषा जो है ये देवताओं की भाषा है. This is a very spurious kind of logic. Remember that in the 6 Vedangas, जो 6 Vedanga हैं, the first 6 auxiliary sciences necessary for the study of Vedas, auxiliary sciences. And I mean, they are coterminous with the Vedas. You see, they were composed while the Vedas were being composed, because in order to understand the Vedas, you needed to know these sciences, 6 sciences. The first science is the science of phonetics. Phonetics. The second science is the science of grammar. The third science is the science of etymology. Etymology, I'm using the English word, but actually nirukta that we have in Vedanga, it is a nirvachana. It is a science of exposition of the meaning of words. Science of exposition of the meanings of words. And the great acharya of nirvachana, nirukta, is Yaska. Yaska, who was a 9th century BC thinker from your part of the country, Gujarat. He was from Nagar Parkar. And that's why many subsequent thinkers say, Nagar Paraskaraye Namah. I offer my oblation to that gentleman from Nagar Parkar. Kutch ke aspas wo town hai. So he is the great acharya of Nirvachana. Yask was a man who swore by knowledge. And he set himself in opposition to the phoneticians. The phoneticians who were the first to formulate a science in India. Phonetics was the first science to develop. Articulation, संस्कृत के मंत्रों का उच्चारण शुद्ध नहीं होगा तो मंत्र का इफेक्ट नहीं होगा. It is almost like अगर आप कहीं बोल रहे हो और अगर आप ऐसे बोल रहे हो कि किसी को समझ नहीं आ रहा, then the purpose of your speaking is not achieved. The purpose of your speaking is that you want to convey something to the other person. He doesn't get it. In the same way, exact pronunciation, very much like ELT people, ELT, Queen's English. ELT people insist on correct pronunciation. Now, in phonetics, the phoneticians, they were very proud people in the Indian tradition, because they said they looked down upon the grammarians. They said, well, we deal with substance. हम धातु से के बाद काम करते हैं, substance से. While grammarians, they deal with only form that the substance takes. And they were not very much concerned with meaning also. They were concerned with correct articulation. So let me as a side inform you that Henry Sweet, the father of International Phonetic Alphabet, IPA, कभी आप गूगल में देखेंगे IPA, International Phonetic, 1895-96 के करीब, 97 के करीब. I am not a very good person for dates. And in any case, in Indian tradition, we don't bother about dates. We bother only about ideas and the chronology of ideas. Around 1896, Henry Sweet, who invented the International Phonetic Alphabet, he said that I got the idea of one symbol for one sound from the Indian phoneticians, and from the Devanagari script. I give you one example. When you write put in English and but, P-U-T, B-U-T. Now it could be but, or put, but. Why not? Isn't it? But if you write put in Nagari and but in Nagari, there is no problem about pronunciation. You will be pronouncing English correctly. Therefore, I strongly suggest that you start writing your English in Devanagari script if you want to avoid, mispronunciations. So the phoneticians, they created a science. And a very elaborate science. There is a 3rd or 4th century BC, text. Katyayana ka Vajasanai Pratishakhya. Vajasanai Pratishakhya. Now, Vajasanai Pratishakhya is Pratishakha. The pronunciation as followed, practiced in a particular school of Vedas. You know, Vedas had, each Ved had many schools, shakhas. Rig Ved had 21 shakhas. Today, only 2 survive, and one of them is almost nearing its death. There are 2 75, 78-year-old brothers in Rajasthan who are practicing that shakha. And once they go, it will go, although people are trying to save it. So 21 schools. So 21 modes of pronunciation. For example, in English, when we speak English, there is a Pinglish, Punjabi English, there is Bengali English, there is Tamil English, you know, Tinglish, Binglish, Pinglish, isn't it? All these varieties are there. So in the same way, Sanskrit also was spoken in different ways, in different areas, by different schools. So phonetics was a science, extremely refined science developed by them. And they were proud. But Yask said that a person who can pronounce a verse shlok correctly without knowing its meaning is like the bearer of a sealed letter. वो जैसे कोई बंद लिफाफा ले जाता है, or he is like the pillar which upholds the ceiling. And then Yask has a statement: eternal is the scorn of the ignorant for knowledge. Eternal is the scorn of the ignorant for knowledge. So, you know, there is this etymology, third science. There are sciences: science of phonetics, science of grammar, science of the exposition of meaning, and fourth, science of meter, Chanda Shastra. Chanda. You will be happy to know, and you will have many occasions to be happy when you are talking about India's wealth of knowledge, that Sanskrit tradition has the most elaborate science of meter. It's most elaborate. And you will be amazed that some of the folk meters of European linguistic communities like Lithuanian, Latvian, East European, the folk poetry of those meters, those communities, has a metrical arrangement which is accounted for by our Sanskrit Chanda Shastra. Sanskrit Chanda Shastra is a highly mathematical permutation, a highly mathematical complex permutation of light and heavy sounds, Guru or Laghu and Guru, light and heavy. There are syllables which are light and heavy in grammar, and in music, those syllables are also light and heavy. So when you have the sa re ga ma, so you have a light sa and a heavy sa, ra ga sa re ga ma pa da ni sa, and the combination of light and sound, light and heavy, infinite permutations and other varieties creates different kinds of rhythm in music. So you know this science of meter. So then of course we have Kalpa, which is social sciences, and we have Jyotish, which is arithmetic, mathematics, and astronomy. So four of the six sciences are sciences of language. And this is and today you have only linguistics, and in linguistics you have many papers. But 5,000 years ago, India had 4 sciences that dealt exclusively with language, different aspects of language. See? Now the point is that because the language has been scientifically analyzed, and in the process, You see what you call, when you analyze something, in the process you understand and you also refine. You refine. After all, when you write a grammar, when a Panini writes the grammar of Sanskrit, he refines the language. You see, he is aware of 10 dialectal possibilities, 10 dialectal possibilities. And of them, he chooses one. And that becomes what we call in modern linguistics the standard usage. Standard. Now, don't start getting democratic. These days it is fashion to be democratic. But the Buddhists were the greatest democrats in their time. The Buddhists said there is no need for grammar. We don't need any grammar because everybody speaks in his own way and communicates the meaning. So why grammar? But then, you see, pedagogically, when you understand language, when you want to teach language to a child, or when you want to understand a language completely, develop an inwardness with language, then you have to have, you see, it is invariable that there will be one dialect which will become the standard. You see, this question has been elaborately discussed, far more elaborately discussed by Patanjali in Mahabhashya, in the Prathama Anika. In the first chapter, he has discussed this elaborately, much more elaborately than you find discussion in the contemporary linguistic series, except that Chomsky himself says that a grammar is necessarily monolectal. A grammar is necessarily monolectal. You see, but you, of course, you can say these are variations, these are deviations. The whole idea about a language teaching, when you Rand Martin's grammar you did in your school, you had several exercises. Correct the following sentences. Correct the following. What does that mean? Not that those errors were not. Those errors were. In fact, there is nothing like an error in language usage, mind you. There is nothing like an error. It's a very wrong practice to give students an exercise of the kind that correct the following sentences. So you give them wrong sentences. Some of those sentences that student is not capable of. He had never made that. But you teach him, you expose him to wrong usage, and then ask him to correct it. It's a wrong exercise because there is no error in usage. All usage is fine. If you communicate your meaning, it's fine. What you have are intermediate usages. You see, when you are young, you started learning a language, you have a particular level of learning, you increase, you go to another level of learning, and you go a level of learning. Anyway, I think I am wandering too far into language teaching, because what I wanted to say is, Dev Bhasha isliye hai that through scientific study of language, this language became a perfect medium for highest poetry and for highest science, technical description. Highest technical description and highest poetry. If you go to Goethe, and Goethe's admiration for Shakuntala, Kalidas play Shakuntala. And if you read Bhartrihari's Shatakatray, 3 sets of 100 poems each on Shringar, Niti, and Vairagya. Look at this. Bhartrihari, a great 5th century philosopher of language, also a poet. If you read his Vakyapadiyam, you see, it's a scientific treatise. You don't have a comparable book on philosophy of language in the whole Western tradition. And I am making this statement in public. I am open to correction or corruption, whatever you want to say. There is no comparable book on philosophy of language as Vakyapadiyam of Bhartrihari, 5th century AD. And if you read that book, you see it is science. But the examples sometimes he gives, they are poetry. Poetry. So that we have in our tradition a very interesting classification by Rajshekhar. Rajshekhar is a 7th century poetician, thinker about literature, who was in the court of the king of Kannauj. Kannauj, but I'm talking to you from Delhi. Kannauj is about 300 kilometers from here. And Kannauj once was an imperial Kannauj, Yashovarman of Kannauj, who sealed the 5 passes to China and blocked the Chinese incursions in 7th century. Yashovarman of Kannauj. Today, Kannauj is a small town which manufactures perfumes. Perfumes होते हैं ना, सुगंधी. बाकी कुछ नहीं है, बहुत ढेरा है. There is a huge mound there of the city that has collapsed. So Kannauj mein bata. So he says, you have a philosopher who is also a poet, or you have a poetic philosopher, or you have a philosophic poet. See, 3. A philosopher who is also a poet. Shankaracharya, for example. You see, his commentary on Brahma Sutra Bhashya, or his commentaries on the Upanishads, powerful treatises. But if you read his Bhaj Govindam Moodmate, great poetry. And even greater, his that poem on the goddess, Tripura Sundari. So great poetry. So he's a philosopher who is also a poet. But there are poetic philosophers. Those who philosophize in a poetic manner. For example, you see Bhartrihari himself in Vakyapadiya. When he is giving you an example, for example, he wants to give you an example of that what you see does not necessarily exist. He gives you the example of a rainbow. Rainbow. So, you have this other philosophical poet, a poetic philosopher. And then you have philosophic poet. A poet like Kalidas. He by no means a philosopher, but his poetry contains a deep philosophy. For example, his Ritu Sanghara, you can read as a poetry of how people make love in different seasons. But Guru Nanak, when Guru Nanak rewrote Ritu Sanghara, he described how people pray to the great God power, pray to Brahman in different seasons, in different ways. You see? So you have a poet who is a philosopher, like the Meghaduta of Kalidas, Meghaduta. The Alkapuri, there is always in the imagination of each one of us a place where there is no suffering. That place does not exist. But there is always an Alkapuri in the mind of that famous 1938 film song, sung by 3 great singers, K.C. Day, the blind father of Manna Day, father or grandfather, father of Manna Day. Then Uma Devi, who was a great singer in her time, and some people say later on, we know her as Tuntun of Indian films. Uma Devi and K.L. Sehgal, 3 of them sing, Dukh ki nadiya jeevan naiya, Asha ke patwar lage. ओ नैया के खेने वाले नैया तेरी पार लगे. पार बसत है देश निराला. Beyond there is a place where there is no suffering, no unhappiness. So you see, from the folk poetry to the great poetry of Meghadut by Kalidas, the human mind always conceptualizes a place beyond where there is no suffering. Because this world is a world of human suffering and a place beyond. So you see, a language which carries philosophy and poetry so lightly and together. You see, the question is, how is it? How is it? Danino ji has said that, you see, first of all, I have told you, it is said Dev Bhasha, not because it is a language of gods, but because it is a language which is a carrier of profound thoughts. Profound thoughts, you see. It's a language in which grand speculation about the Brahman, the grand speculation about the Brahman, a language in which, you see, you go beyond what is observable and you begin to see with your eyes shut and you speculate on what lies beyond. I remember Coleridge, you know, in his biography on India, he says the poets are people who belong to the higher territory of the mind. There is a wonderful novel, The Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. Kindly read it if you find time. The Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. See, so people who belong to the high territory of the mind, they look beyond. For Coleridge, all of us are like people who are in the bottom of a valley. And around us, there are hills. Around us, there are boundaries of our knowledge. We don't know beyond. But people who belong to the higher territory, they are able to go to look beyond those hills. See, look beyond those. And then when you look beyond, you look what is not visible to the ordinary people. So the whole conception in Sanskrit of apara vidya and para vidya, the knowledge of this visible, observable, quantifiable world, and the knowledge of what lies beyond and outside this visible, quantifiable world. In fact, what you do not see, what you do not observe is an ocean, and what you see and observe is only a small puddle, a small puddle. So when you go to knowledge of that in a language that makes possible paravidya, you see, that's why it's a language. The deva is a metaphor where dev is a kind of, you call an honorific word for a language which is capable of such profound expression, And if, sir, you want to say something?
May I ask a question at this point? Because we do understand and feel how Sanskrit has been a vehicle for these profound thoughts, but it has also been a vehicle for other fields of knowledge.
Yeah.
For example, technologies, sciences, architecture, the arts, and so on and so forth. So what has made this incredible versatility of Sanskrit, that it has been such a powerful tool in expressing knowledge in all fields, polity, governance? There is no end to the list of areas of knowledge that Sanskrit has served well. And even today, we are struggling to find, to bend the modern Indian languages to the new fields of knowledge, and it is going to be a long exercise. So what has made this possible for Sanskrit?
No, I think when I was saying that it's because it's a carrier of powerful thought, I was including the sciences, architecture, and everything there. You see, it's a big, and when I'm making this distinction between observable and beyond observation, you see, the sciences, the observable sciences are like, for example, but then, you know, there no area of knowledge is such which is founded only on what is quantifiable and observable. You see, for example, the modern physics, you see, the whole foundation of E is equal to mc square doesn't belong to the realm of observable. You see, the foundation is always the flight of the human mind, the capacity to go beyond, and the ability of a language to express it. You see, the kind of people who have worked in that language. Now, the question that what has made that versatility, that in fact, you can have a whole university purely based on Sanskrit disciplines and Sanskrit texts. You don't need any other. You can have a whole university of multiple disciplines with the text, your text coming only from Sanskrit, Prakrit, and Pali tradition. I don't separate the three because you see, this is a highly evolved evolution, the process of language development by which these languages are some kind of, you know, forms of modulations of each other. So there is this ability comes from, you know, look at I think it comes from the analytical strength that was put into the language from the beginning at different levels of language structure, phonetics, morphology, syntax, semantics. So you have the phoneticians, you had the morphologists like Panini, and you have semanticists like the great Amar Singh Amarakosha, and also semanticists like Yask. So there has been a large input into it, but above all, it gained its strength by the practitioners, the great minds who for thousands of years used the language to express the entire range of human thought, entire range, from poetry to whatever, architecture or, you know, mathematics or astronomy or galaxies. And there is nothing for which Sanskrit does not have a word. You see, and Sanskrit from the beginning to today is the donor language. Donor. It has never borrowed a word from any language. It's a donor language and a donor tradition. Even today, Sanskrit is a donor tradition. If in 1890, as I said last time, if in 1890, you know, the Harvard Oriental series starts translating Sanskrit books, when Max Muller translates Sacred Books of the East, 123 plus 72, 194, out of which 92 and 72, 164 have already been done. So that means late 19th century, as late as 19th century, Europe felt the need to borrow the ideas from Sanskrit. So it's a donor language. It is because, you see, a language becomes rich by its practitioners. And you have a galaxy of thinkers, you know, thinkers and commentators. Some of our greatest minds have been the exegetes, you know, exegetes. Punjabi, when Punjabi language was enriched, by whom? Once the gurus composed the Gurvani, the language became rich. Now, it was from the beginning, because see, it's too far back. The Sanskrit had a large spoken area. It was a bhasha. Panini writes the grammar of bhasha, spoken language. And that vast spoken area, that for ages, it was a language on which there were two kinds of work. One is from outside the language, that is grammar, phonetics, morphology, and the inside, the great minds using the language. And you have evidence of that. You have the text. So the language became enriched. I will give you some examples. For example, you see, I mentioned Katyan's Varnamala. No language in the world, No language in the world has you see, you can imagine today if you read phonetics books and all that, you will have charts and tables. But imagine 4th century BC, somebody properly, giving in such a scientific statement of the sounds of language. आपको इतनी आदत है अपनी भाषा की कि आप पहचानते ही नहीं हो कि कितनी साइंटिफिक है आपकी भाषा. जैसे क ख ग घ ng, क ख ग घ ng, क voiceless stop, kha aspirated stop, ga voiced stop, gha voiced aspirated stop, nga voiced aspirated nasal stop. You see the system. And then ka cha ta tapa, ka cha ta tapa, ka kha ga cha cha ja ta ta, ka cha ta tapa. Ka is sounds which are born here. Cha little ahead, ta more ahead, ta, and then pa, the place of articulation. So you structure it according to how it is articulated, ka, kha, ga, ga, nga, horizontally, and the place where it is articulated. And then you have the semi, ya, va, ra, la, what are called semi vowels. And then you have spirants like sa, sha, sha, sa, ha. All this in modern linguistics, when you study in phonetics and all that, you are so deeply impressed. But then the origin is in Kate and Bashir. Now, when you have such understanding of the phonics, what produces great poetry? The auditory quality. It is very important. For great poetry, apart from thought, it is the phonics which is important. And when you have a morphologist like Panini, who can split a word into its parts, and he creates the possibility of permutation and modulation. And then look at the syntax. All Indian languages today have the basic syntax of Sanskrit. What is that? It is a verb final language. All Indian languages are verb final languages. English is not a verb final language. We don't say he food eats. In English, we say he eats food. But in Indian languages, it is he food eats. Wo khana khata hai. All Indian languages are verb final. And secondly, the syntactic power of the fact that in Indian languages, you can have a sentence, verbless sentences. All Indian languages can have verbless sentences. And thirdly, all Indian languages are left branching languages. Now, this is a little subtle distinction, left branching and right branching. You see, it's like this, that when you first give the properties, and then you give the object of which you are giving the properties. A tall, beautiful, handsome, tall, beautiful, handsome, gills, Jat, Sikh, let us say. So tall, beautiful, handsome. And the subject, the head comes at the end. This is called left branch. You see, you have it's called the right branching. That is, the head comes there. In this structure, your mind is always expecting that what are you talking about? You see, the expectation, what you want to know comes at the end about what something is being done. In the left branching.
There was a break of about half a minute. You were giving this example of tall, handsome, beautiful something, and then you said this is right branching.
Yeah.
There was a
this is right branching because where the full understanding of meaning is suspended till you reach the last, you see. Yes. And the left branching is where you begin with what you're talking about, and then you give its attributes. Tall, Sikh, Gil, Jat, handsome, who is handsome, beautiful, this is left branching. Now the right branching syntax leads to compounds, compounding, compounds. Compounds are, जो समास होते हैं, a study of the language. So see, it became a science to study the language, analytics, and so many sciences developed. In the process, the language got refined, the syntax got refined, the compounding, the lexical richness, because I don't have time, but let me tell you, Deccan College, Pune, has been preparing a dictionary on historical principle, Sanskrit dictionary, for the last 40 years. And they are still on the first letter A. And they have made about 1 million entries. It's such profound richness, the generative capacity of Sanskrit, which comes from the root and the prefixation and suffixation, and endless combinations. For those who have studied a little bit of Yask's Nirukta, or have seen Panini's Dhatu Patha or his Gana Patha, they will understand from where this prolific richness of the language comes, creativity, how the poets, the philosophers, those who described the treatises of temple building, they never were in short of a word for what they wanted to say, So this richness partly, syntactic richness, we have a compounding. Sanskrit, you will have sometimes a whole paragraph is a single compound. You see the density of ideas that can be achieved if you can put together, knit the ideas into an interdependence. You see, knitting the idea. ये समास जिसको हम कहते हैं compound, हमारे अंग्रेजी में we are generally familiar with two word compounds, by August rain and something like that. But you have in Sanskrit elaborate compounds. That means it's possible. You take a sentence of Sanskrit, count its syllables. You paraphrase it into a modern Indian language or English, and you will find that there is a 30% increase in the syllabic number. That means the intensity of expression in Sanskrit is much greater. There is an article by Bhandarkar, R.G. Bhandarkar, it is, I think, sometime 1881-82, Bhandarkar Oriental Research Institute of Pune, you see. And there he has an article, and it is available in the Abori Journal of the Bhandarkar Oriental Research Institute. The article is Evolution of Technical Style in Sanskrit. Evolution of Technical Style in Sanskrit. By the way, I know about Hindi, my language, or about Punjabi, that we don't have a technical style in these languages yet. We don't have. In fact, when I was asked to write encyclopedia entries on Panini and Patanjali and Ashtadhyayi and Vakyapadya for a children's encyclopedia in Hindi, I found it difficult because when I started writing technical, what was technical? It became a kind of a narrative story, loose style, loose, prolix style. Panini was a man from Lahore who was born in this. You see, this is left branching, and the absence of a technical style. But Sanskrit evolved with a technical style and a possibility of compounding, density of expression. Compounding comes from right branching. And that made it possible for Sanskrit to be an ideal vehicle for sciences. And its phonics, its phonology, the knowledge, the auditory phonetics, the articulatory phonetics, the psychological phonetics. You see, for example, in Sanskrit, each sound has a god and each sound has a color. Now, it's unimaginable. You are crossing categorical boundaries when you say that the sound has a color. But this is the psychology of sounds. So sometimes when somebody speaks and we say, "Ke, are, bahut kam bolo, bada kasht ho raha hai." So somewhere, this is the psychological impact that the sound has on you. Sound has on you. So this is important, that the ability, the versatility of language came from its structure at different levels: phonology, morphology, syntax. I gave some examples. And sir, the entire India is a communicative zone. Maurice Emmanuel, thank you very much for saying that I am at the age of 83, I'm still around. But Maurice Emmanuel, at the age of 92, he wrote a wonderful article, India as a Linguistic Area. India as a linguistic area. You see, so India is not just a linguistic area. India is a communicative zone. If you walk through the country, walk, don't fly, take off from Delhi and land in Trivandrum. You will have problems. But if you walk through the country, at no point the intelligibility will break down. At no point. It's like, gradually you get used to water and food. Gradually you get adapted to the language, and the intelligibility will not break down at all. Will not break down at all. And this communicability, India is a communication zone, because we don't go by the census that there are 1476 or 1526 languages. You see, there are 5 Prakrits in this country. 5 Prakrit hai bas is desh mein. I belong to Amritsar. I come from Amritsar. If I start walking from Amritsar, talking the kind of Hindi Punjabi mix that I speak, I can come to Delhi, I can go to Haryana, I can go to Rajasthan, go to Gujarat, I can go to Maharashtra, I can go to from Maharashtra, Madhya Pradesh, from Madhya Pradesh, I can go to UP, from UP, I can go to Bihar. This entire area, I will cover with the language which I speak, and I will be understood. This is one Prakrit. This is one Prakrit. But when I come to Maharashtra, if I go down towards Belgaum and go down, then gradually there is an inflection of the Tamil group of languages, and gradually you are Malayalam, Tamil, Telugu, and Kannada. You are the second Prakrit. This is the second Prakrit. And from Andhra, if you go via Dandakaranya to Odisha, from Odisha towards Bengal, you have the third Prakrit, which goes up to Assam. Third Prakrit. And the fourth Prakrit are the Sino-Tibetan languages. Sino-Tibetan languages spoken in northeast and over. And the fifth is the Dardik or the Pahari languages. But in all these 5 Prakrits, there is a lexical communality. The lexis, not only the lexis, even the myths are shared. In the northeast, in Jaintia Hills, where they grow those small oranges. They tell you that when Hanuman was carrying the mountain from Himalayas to Lanka, the seeds fell here, orange seeds. So you see, it's not only the sharing of the lexis, it is the sharing of the whole cultural ethos, the sharing of the narratives, the sharing of the ideas, and lexical sharing is enormous, both in the ordinary language and in the technical language. So to say that it's a today, if you have some idea, sir, that Sanskrit was a spoken language and great texts were composed in it. So we had compositional language. After 500 years, 600 years, the compositional language became fixed, but the spoken language changed. So when Mahatma Buddha came, 1,000 years later, he wanted to speak in the language of the market, language of the village, which is Pali. Palli is village. Palli means market. The language came to be known as Pali. The language he used was Pali. Pali was simply the evolution of language in speech. And then a few hundred years later, when the Jain thinkers wanted to speak, by that time, the Pali canon, the Buddhist text, huge canon of Pali text, compositional language. Sir, the compositional language becomes a frozen, but spoken language keeps changing, keeps changing. Eliot's poetry, the language in which he wrote poetry, Eliot's poetry, the language will remain the same in 200 years. But the language spoken by people of London has changed over time. Nobody speaks Eliot's English in London today, or Bill, ever. So you see, when the Jain thinkers came, they again spoke in the language of the people, Prakrit. Now the Prakrit became a proper noun, but Prakrit is a common noun. Prakrit versus Sanskrit. Prakrit is the natural language. Sanskrit is the language which you derive from the spoken language to compose. See, for example, now when I am speaking, I am composing. Normally, when I am conversing, I do not always speak complete sentences. But here I am speaking complete sentences. So my compositional language is extracted from the spoken language. But nobody can say, I am not speaking the spoken language. I am speaking the spoken language, but it is the compositional form. That's why the myth that Sanskrit was, never spoken language, Sanskrit was a textual language. You cannot. There is no language which is only written language. The English of Eliot and the English of people spoken by the people were the same language, but the compositional language is a idealization and extraction. So entire Indian subcontinent is a communicative zone, and the versatility of Sanskrit is very much there today, even today. If anybody wants to work in any Indian domain of knowledge, I will even advise the JNU students, for any domain of knowledge, you want to do some new thinking, you better begin with a text from Sanskrit. That will give you a new perspective. And it is done. It is being done. It is done by people. It is done in a huge way. It is being done even in Europe, even in America, in a huge way. So the versatility and the richness, as I said, Sanskrit remains the donor language, and Sanskrit tradition remains the donor tradition.
So
yes, sir.
Are you telling us that we would benefit by dipping into this vast fount of thought and knowledge, which we have not exhausted? Should we revisit this?
No, I think absolutely, sir. I'm not just saying that. I am in fact arguing that if Indians have to make a contribution in any field of knowledge, they have to work in their own tradition. In 200 years of English education, 187 years, what has India contributed? Nothing. Because we took to the English language, to the Western knowledge, and abandoned our own ground, We created nothing. But look at Europe. Europe took to Sanskrit studies in 19th century. By 1807, every European university had a chair in Sanskrit. And they adopted. In 19th century Europe, every bright young person was doing Sanskrit the way Indians today are doing commerce and computer. And Europe, by interacting with the Indian tradition, they created a new discipline, historical linguistics. They created a new system of thought, structuralism, and they produced some very great minds: Schiller, Schelling, Saussure, the Trubetskoy, and you name any, Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. There was no great 19th century European thinker who was either not a Sanskritist or had not worked in Sanskrit. But India, 187 years, what have we done? Nothing, because we abandoned our own knowledge. So if Indians have to make any contribution, even in management, even in technology, you have to ask yourself, how could these stones float in the Ram Setu? Why don't you try to find out? It is possible. And in our text, even in Kannad's Vaisheshik Sutra, there is a formula. That when the mass of an object is more than the mass of the environment, the object will sink. And if the mass is the same as the mass of the environment, then it will float in air or in water. But if the mass is less than the mass of the environment, then it will fly. So the single formula in a philosophical text gives you the three explanations for three phenomena. Why don't people start working on that? वो न्यूटन ने बोला जी एप्पल गिरा सिर पे, एप्पल गिरा तो सब चीजें नीचे गिरती हैं. We are still fixed on Newton's apple and Adam's apple. There are two apples in the Western tradition which have kept us engaged.
Kapilji, here we have with us a young scholar of the history of Indian mathematics who is working on an ancient procedure of the 8th century and trying to show, and he has almost demonstrated that it is more effective than the corresponding current procedure. So in that way, it's about, I feel, drawing inspiration from the concepts, the methods, not exactly the ancient facts. That doesn't matter. We agree that tradition is not something fixed that we have to repeat or ever the same again and again. It's about drawing inspiration, right? Would you agree with this?
Absolutely, sir.
Getting fresh.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. In fact, when I say that if we want to make any contribution, we have to work in our tradition. Where working in tradition means we read, we become familiar with the ideas that were evolved over thousands of years in a particular domain of knowledge. From there, it will be easy for us to move ahead. And a tradition is always parampara. Parampara is a much better word than tradition. That is earlier, later, later becomes earlier, then later. So the whole notion of evolution is built into this parampara.
Yes.
Right, sir?
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
And for your inexhaustible energy and
Thank you, sir.
this is great. Thank you.
Thank you. Namaskar.